Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Myth Salon. My name is Dana White, and today I'm really privileged to have an old friend, a young friend who I've been in my life for a long time, Dr. Lori Pye. And I just came back, as a lot of you know, from 3 weeks in southern Italy. And as much as I would like to say that Italy is a wonderful place to visit, I'm struck by how I carry a sense of privilege with me to a place that doesn't have a lot of privilege, that doesn't have a lot of abundance and a lot of opportunities. There's a reason why southern Italy really doesn't have the kind of rampant tourism of Florence and Milan and Rome and Venice. It's just the one thing you get there are the people, you get the land, you get a beautiful part of the earth, and you feel it. You feel their care for what they do. So I thought about today about the concern that we have for the world that we live in. And as I do, I want to read a short poem, and the first thing I wanted to do was this poem, Fire and Ice by Robert Frost. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold those who favor fire. But if I had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. While I was over in Italy, my son came down from Berlin, and he introduced me to a new piece of, I think it's pretty scary software. It's AI, and it will create something that you ask it to. So I asked it to write a poem about climate activism. And what it wrote was, with fires raging and ice caps melting, the earth is crying out for help. Our planet's health is slowly wilting. It's time for us to take a stand and yelp. From marches to strikes, we raise our voice, urging leaders to make a change. We know the consequences. We have no choice. Our future is at stake. It's not strange. Let's work together to heal the earth and protect it for generations to come. Climate activism, a noble birth. Let's fight for a better tomorrow, not just some. Now, it's weird to me that that came out of an artificial intelligence program. And generations are going to grow up now with artificial intelligence and not have the imagination to construct something like that, or the point of view that would heal the earth. We may rely upon the devices that we have already imagined, much like the Steven Spielberg movie, AI. And pretty soon the machines that we made make us. And there's something kind of weird about that we have lived so far beyond ourselves that we no longer know how to live ourselves and how to be ourselves. So I really look forward to a lively discussion among this superb panel. I would like to open again with a moment of silence, if you will. Let's think about, not say something. Be still. I'm so honored that everyone is here today. Thank you very much for participating. Will, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana, and thanks for opening up to a whole new direction and territory than I expected us to go tonight. But I normally think about nature and the need to restore the climate. The need to restore nature is a need to restore vitality in the living earth and the stuff outside of us. But AI brings in a question of where is the vitality even at a cognitive level? If this is artificial cognition, is there a need to restore or take care of vitality and cognition in the same way that we need to take care of vitality in our tomatoes and in our world? Thanks for opening those up to get us started, Dana. This is a recurring topic for us. We kind of come back to this topic of nature quite a bit. It's really important for us as mythologists. And I remember this time last year with Talk Thompson, we were talking about indigenous mythologies, patterning relationships with nature that can help us out of our climate crisis today. It does come up for us quite a bit, and that's why it's really wonderful to focus today in a Myth Salon on a relationship between the environment and psyche, especially with the esteemed Lori Pye, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But first, I should introduce our panel. Dana White, host of the Myth Salon, contributing faculty to Pacifica's Myth degrees and author of numerous volumes of mythology. I am Will Linn, moderator of our evening, story producer, and host of a series for ZDF Sky and the History Channel called Myths, the Greatest Mysteries of Humanity. We're joined, as usual, by our friend, Dr. Dennis Patrick Slattery, who is a distinguished emeritus professor in the Mythological Studies program at Pacifica Graduate Institute. Dennis is the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of 31 volumes, including 7 of poetry and 1 novel. His latest book is The Fictions and Our Convictions, Essays on the Cultural Imagination. His paintings, pottery, blogs, books, and upcoming events can be found at DennisPatrickSlattery.com. Kenny Ausubel is an award-winning social entrepreneur, author, journalist, and filmmaker. Kenny is the founder and CEO of Bioneers, an internationally recognized nonprofit dedicated to disseminating breakthrough solutions for restoring people and planet. He co-founded the national company Seeds of Change in 1989 and served as CEO until 1994 to restore backyard biodiversity into the food web through marketing organic, biodiverse heirloom seeds to gardeners. Kenny's a writer, filmmaker, and media professional. He's written 4 books and edited several volumes of the Bioneers anthology series. His most recent, Dreaming the Future, Reimagining Civilizations in the Age of Nature, won the Nautilus Grand Gold Prize in the Ecology Environment category. He acted as a central advisor to Leonardo DiCaprio's feature documentary, The 11th Hour, and appears in the film. His documentary, Hoxie, How Healing Becomes a Crime, was named for the Best Censored Stories Award for Investigative Journalism. We remember him for his visit regarding the documentary series he produced with Dr. Tarnas, Changing the Gods. Great to have you back, Kenny. Michael Linn is a business executive and board member who earned his MBA from Harvard. He's also my dad. Hey, Dad. And ever since I was a kid, we'd be talking about smart and energy efficient houses. The first time he retired, I wrote a business plan with him that became a geothermal company, that became a software company that focused on the routing of energy. In the last few years, he's been helping my brother with the home automation company that continues the family focus on smart homes and energy efficient homes. A couple of years ago, we got together on the Climate Bootcamp, a collaboration between Harvard Alumni Association, Climate Reality, and Story Atlas, designed to train business leaders on bringing change to their organization. Hey, Dad. Corinne Bourdeau is the founder and visionary behind 360 Degrees Communications, a leading entertainment marketing company that specializes in environmental and social justice films and conferences. She's worked on the Academy Award-winning films The Cove, Free Solo, and films such as Fantastic Fungi, Biggest Little Farm, Wind Life, Sea of Shadows, Wild Hope, All That Breathes, and many others. Corinne is also the founder and director of the Esalen Film Festival. She is a graduate of the Pacifica Graduate Institute and recently completed the Pacifica Eco-Psychology program. She's been with us several times and helped us put together the Pulling Focus series. Lori, finally, tonight, Lori Pye is president of the Veritas Graduate Institute, International School of Eco-Psychology. Dr. Pye comes from a background in education, health, and environmental and marine conservation. She holds a doctorate in cultural mythology and depth psychology and is a leader in developing the field of eco-psychology. As director of several NGO organizations, she worked to co-develop the Eastern Tropical Pacific Biological Seascape Corridor with the ministers of the environment from Costa Rica, Colombia, Panama, and Ecuador. She was the executive director for Sea Shepherd Conservation Society and education director for John Michael Cousteau's Ocean Futures. Dr. Pye teaches internationally, has multiple publications in peer-reviewed journals, and serves on the editorial board for Eco-Psychology Journal. She is a member of IUCN's Commission on Education and Communication and the European Ecopsychology Society. She also serves as faculty for Kaweah Delta Psychiatric Residency Program, University of California in Santa Barbara, and Pacifica Graduate Institute. Welcome, Dr. Pai. She's going to introduce us to some material, and then the rest of us will join when she's ready. Take us away.
It's an honor to be here tonight with this esteemed panel. Thank you, Dana, for inviting me. It's good to be with you again. And Corinne, nice to meet you. We've met before, but lovely to be with you. And of course, Dennis, my old captain, love being with you as well. And Kenny. What I thought we'd do tonight is present a few ideas and then open it up to the panel so that we have a conversation with you all tonight. And it's an important conversation when we talk about climate. And I want to kind of bring that into a different focus. When we think about climate, can we reframe how we think about it in the sense of it not being something external or out there that is not a part of us or that we are not a part of, that is something that happens out there? It's not an existential crisis that we're in. It's an everyday on the ground situation that we face because we are of the climate. And that's what I want to kind of get into a little bit tonight. If we think about how humans have understood, how we've interpreted, how we have imagined our story with Earth, our narrative of Earth, it's always been deeply entangled with our self-perception as humans. Our narratives of our cherished exceptionalism, our supremacism in our relationship or lack of to others and the planet. That right there is a mouthful, but it really sets a focus for, well, how do we understand our relationship to climate? How do we understand our relationship to the planet, which is a shared home? And this kind of entanglement, I think, really provides both challenges and opportunities for us to explore tonight and maybe deepen ourselves into understanding how we are a part of these planetary processes. It may be also that our task is to unlearn what we think we know and learn anew who and what we are with a shared, very active, behaviorally active planet. Meaning the planet has agency. It's going to respond to us, and we are in turn going to respond to the planet. To perhaps make sense, to sense and make sense of what is not always obvious in movements of life and death, of which climate involves us in, because it's the climate that determines where we all live, non-humans and humans. It determines our resources. It determines if we survive or even if we flourish or not. So it's a big topic. It's a critical topic. And I think, you know, another idea that we can examine a little bit tonight, that Earth can heal itself. It has done that for 4.6 billion years and is very good at its processes and its processual activities at healing itself, maintaining itself. What we, I think, need to focus on is where we are in that mix, perhaps healing ourselves before we try to reach out and do something with the planet. And of course, healing is in quotes because we don't really know what that is, but healing ourselves, maybe examining, exploring, understanding who and what we are as an ecological organism. So a few things I just want to lay out before we go to the panel here to give us some discussion points. That first of all, weather and climate are a little bit different. Weather is conditions of the atmosphere, you all know, over a short period of time, whereas climate is really that long-term behavior over periods of time. So there's a little bit difference there. So let's start with some of the things that were presented to me about tonight with hosting and carrying on this conversation with feelings of overwhelm. And certainly my students, I'm sure all of you in your communications with folks probably hear this a lot, that when we talk about climate change or a changing climate or a climate crisis, we immediately go into feeling, which is a good thing. Feeling of overwhelm, though, which if there's overwhelm, etymologically, there's probably meaning something that we're resisting there. So feelings of overwhelm or resistance regarding climate and climatic events are in part perhaps due to a lack of knowledge and understanding planetary movements. And planetary movements, again, aren't out there. They're not things. They are processes that involve us all. And when I say us, I mean non-humans and humans. We're all a part of these active processes. And how we participate knowingly and unknowingly in the planet's movements, in its processes, determine its climate. So, climate doesn't just happen in the atmosphere. We participate in co-shaping the climate. And I think that is something that is really interesting to understand, because we tend to think that climate is something that does something to us. So if we start with the idea that we are of the climate, as all critters are, whales, dolphins, wolves, earthworms, humans, we are of the climate. That is not to say that we are one with. We are not one with the planet. We are of these processes. We are participants with these processes. So when we talk about a climate crisis, we're talking about, I think, a psychological crisis, meaning a relational crisis. That's what psychology is. It's relational, relationship. So we're talking about a relational crisis. But I don't think it has to be that. I think that there's so much room and opportunity, challenges and opportunity for understanding more about what's going on, so that we can make better decisions about what we want to do in our daily lives that can make a big difference in climate processes going forward. And I think if we can break down what we understand about climate processes and how we are a part of them, and to kind of get under what it is to live and die with a responsive planet, then we can get to how we feel, how we sense the suffering of others. And in that way, we, I think, have an opportunity to learn how to respond differently, how to be responsive, respond reciprocally, respond responsibly, which of course etymologically are related. So there's two tenets I want to lay out for us. And the first tenet is an ecological tenet, but I also think about it psychologically, that every critter responds to its environment. In turn, the environment responds and influences its organisms. I like the word critter. So we are in reciprocal relationships with a shared planet. We co-shape our environments, and our environments co-shape us. When we think about that psychologically, that makes sense. We are co-shaped by our family environments, our culture, our societal environments, lineage, ancestor, experiences. Those co-shape the narratives that we live out or that live us out. So that's one idea there. And it kind of contradicts the idea that I think we tend to have, that the planet is a thing that does something to me or does something to us humans, as if we're passive or lack agency or certainly lack imagination, and that we're not as processual as the planet. We are processual. We are in process. We're not done evolving, I hope. We are an active processual human critter. The second tenet is small changes lead to big effects. Think about our little earthworm that's taking down all kinds of little things into its earthworm habitat. It mulches those down and then produces castings, which make the soils of the planet. Little earthworm doing small things, making big effects. And so small changes can make big effects, both positively and negatively. So for example, small changes to intricate, interdependent systems have large, unanticipated consequences. We can think about that psychologically as well, too. When we make a small change, whether we've thought through it or not, or felt through it, or considered it carefully, it can have unanticipated consequences. Those can be really great, they can be beneficial, or they can be poisonous, they can be toxic. So all life forms, all of us, live with a complex, mature, responsive planet that acts upon us as much as we act upon the planet. So I think that shifts a worldview, a planetary view, in the sense of we live with something that does something to us. And if we're in a climate change crisis, it's out there, it's existential, it doesn't have anything to do with us, or it only affects us if we're caught in a climate change event. And I think that's part of the issue of why we feel anxiety, we feel emotions of overwhelm or despair, hopelessness. And I want to focus on that a little bit, because I think if we understand who we are as ecological organisms, who we are as ecological beings, and how we actually participate in these co-shaping events, we can reduce some of this angst, some of this fear, the phobia, and the phobias, the gods of the phobias that come when we start to think about these big, large-scale events that we talk about with climate. So I'll focus a little bit on how we are ecological, because it's not enough, I don't think, to say, well, we're a part of nature, we should just take care of it, and that should be able to, end all of our problems. And that's not really a sophisticated understanding of being a part of these very complex processes. And we are as complex as any organism. So when I say we're a part of these planetary processes, it means everything that we do, ways that we think, our activities, our practices, essentially our narratives, our behaviors, and our practices co-shape our environments, our climate, our weather patterns, and in turn, those affect us. If you think about that, we're all affected by weather patterns and certainly large-scale climatic patterns. So the opportunity here then, I think, urges us to examine our psychic climate, our psychological climates as co-shapers of climatic processes. And that means examining narratives, their behaviors, and their practices. Now, this is kind of mythic in scope, so we're not going to get to all of this tonight for sure. But I think a few ideas that we can work through together with the panel will help open this up for everybody. And the first one I will share with everyone, I'd like to hear from the panel on this as well, is ways to decenter our human exceptionalism, decenter our exceptionalist, supremacist, human-centered worldview. And staying in that worldview then really is a denial of who we and what we are as ecological beings. And that changes then how we participate. If we don't understand how we're ecological, if we stay with the framing of human exceptionalism or supremacy, then our behavior will follow that narrative. And of course, that has historically been our behavior and our practice, not only with each other, but toward the planet as well. And as such, we've destroyed or are destroying a shared home. It's not just about changing the climate. It's about destroying habitats that all non-human critters live with and inhibiting their abilities to do all the things that they do differently that participate in shaping a livable climate. So it's much more than just changing climatic processes. It's affecting all other organisms on the planet and how they co-shape and factor into climate processes. So it's, it's the responsibility there. I think some people can feel overwhelmed by that kind of responsibility. But as we go through these ideas tonight and break them down, I'm hoping that we can kind of reframe the angst and the fear around thinking about the climate and the planet, going to hell in a handbag overnight, because I don't think that's really what's going to be happening here. Certainly, our political practices, historical political practices, have put us in a position now where we will incur climate events. We already are. It's not about what's going to happen. It's we are in those. And we will have to get through those. And learning how you're ecological, how you participate in these large-scale processes, how we are processual, then I think gives us very good ideas for how to become ecologically literate and how to develop psychological capacities that we're going to need going forward, dealing with more perhaps exacerbated climate events. And in a sense, we're resituating who and what we are, perceiving differently, understanding differently who we are in the mix, the wider scheme of things. And certainly you can hold on to whatever myths you have about the planet and its history, But then you have to live with the technologies that follow that worldview, and those can be very destructive. So on that first idea of decentering our exceptionalistic, supremacist, human-centered worldview, I'm wondering if any of our panel have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, let me just really, really good, Lori, and really loaded. And I've been scribbling notes on the outline that you gave us, and I printed it out. How to shift an attitude is what I'm thinking about. And that egocentric, human-centered, top of the hierarchical chain of being requires an attitudinal shift, where the myth that has been promulgated, and even more today with the intensity and the rise of white supremacy, it needs to be remade. I don't have a program for it, but I think it has to do with the vision that we have of ourselves within our inner cosmology, and with that being more generously inflected, it can change this outer attitude. I like what you said early on about the flow of the co-shaping. I'm not sure that that's very alive in the average person's thinking, but I think it's absolutely essential that it becomes a feedback loop. And now you just cite, because I went back to my notes on Emerson's Nature, an essay that with the Oversoul is enough for an entire course. And he says at one point, what we are, that only can we see.
Yeah.
What we are, that's all that we can see. So it's the it's the enlarging and deepening of the ourness that I think is one way to at least begin to think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're suggesting there, Dennis, something that actually really does deepen us into this conversation, that we move from an I, an individual, to a we, to an us, which also then shifts the image that we have of ourselves.
Absolutely, and decenters the energy.
Yeah.
To keep that idea of the energy flow alive, and in what way is it flowing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, this decentering idea is an ethical idea. We're talking ethics essentially here, decentering us from the middle. But the image shift is to get rid of the hierarchical tree of life, because there really is no tree of life. It's an entangled bank, as Darwin suggested. And we are as messy as any ecosystem. But as long as we have that image of this hierarchical tree of life and humans at the top of that, then that exceptionalism, that supremacism is held in place by that image.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yes.
I want to build on that image of the tree of life and think about when we left the tree of life was the moment of decentralization. Like literally, that was when in the myth, humans left the center. And the insight that triggered that departure from the center was represented by the fruit. But one of the things that you see in the fruit, one of the key insights in the fruit, is that here in this moment, this fruit is in a state of fruition. Like I am in a state of fruition. And you start to see a connection between the life cycle of the fruit, the life cycle of the person. That's the key insight here. And so this is like a Copernican revolution of your identity, to recognize that I, in my special journey, my very unique journey, is actually a journey that I share with fruits, with animals, with nature. And you see it there in that essential moment that leads to the decentralization in the myth, the departure from home. So sometimes I think, turning back to our own stories and really engaging them. Sometimes, I guess that's what a lot of us are all about. But that one jumps out to me as one that might help us with the message of decentralization.
It's a hard move to make, to think about decentering ourselves. It calls everything that we understand about who we are as a human into question. But I think that's exactly where we are and what we ought to be doing, questioning everything we understand about who we are and what we are.
Well, Lori, I'd
Michael?
like to
Yeah.
give you a very ancient answer to your question. Go sit in nature, be silent,
Mm-hmm.
watch the bees, look at the trees, and they will begin to talk to you about their interconnectedness and how we are interconnected. So I think we've become isolated. This hierarchy of the tree of life illusion that we have, many of us live not being out in nature. Many of us go all day and all night and the next day in an artificial environment. It becomes easy to believe. So I have a favorite quote. E.O. Wilson makes a comment that we have Paleolithic emotions with medieval institutions and godlike technology. And I would add that the question you're asking is really critical, because we better get these in alignment. And that alignment means learning that we're part of life.
We are the nature we seek to understand.
Yeah. And Lori, this is Corinne. I'd also like to bring somebody's work to the forefront. I know Kenny knows her, and she's a speaker at Bioneers, and she was also, I was just so gifted to have her as the professor in the eco-psychology program, is Janine Canty, and her recent book, Returning the Self to Nature, Undoing Our Collective Narcissism and Healing Our Planet. I mean, how's that for a title? That just about says it all, but I would put that on the top of everybody's reading, and her work is just so powerful around this narcissism. And I'll just say one thing. I was just at a film screening the other night about called Alpenland, about a small little mountain town in the Alps, and how a big company came in and built this glitzy ski resort that was all full of Gucci. And I said, if ever, I was reading this book at the time, and I felt like, there it is on the big screen, this narcissism of just coming in and saying, we can tear down your entire mountain and put nonstop Gucci ski stores. And it's just, such a powerful example. But I do want to put her book and her work out there. And I know you know her, and Kenny knows her. Kenny's Bioneers has been a big champion of her work.
She's been working on narcissism, these ideas for such a long time. She really articulates it so well, so beautifully. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that,
at some point if she works on it long enough.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. There's probably so many different forms of it, but I love her work. Thanks for bringing that forward as well, too. So, what we're doing here, folks, is we're working through some ideas, which give us eyes to see if we want. But if we also wanted to be mythic about that, we might be trying to darken our eyes to see in darker times. I know Dennis knows that quote from the Odyssey. It's where I learned it from, Dennis. But the ideas that we're working with, they may sound really big, and like, how do we do that? And if you just hang with us, I'll get to some of the ways that we actually can do this. So that they're not just big ideas out there that we'll never be able to attain or to get to. So decentering human exceptionalism, decentering from humans, from this understanding that we're the middle of everything and everything revolves around us, as it should. And that is a very deeply embedded narrative. And so, what I'm presenting here are ideas to help us try to examine, more deeply explore our narratives. But before I jump to another idea, I want to see if Kenny has something to say.
Yeah, thanks, Lori. Good conversation. There's so many dimensions to what some of the points that you're raising here, and so many, we could go down many rabbit holes, but the two things that I would just mention is we're getting an environmental education the hard way right now. We live in an ecologically illiterate civilization for the most part, with important exceptions. And it's going to bring civilization to our knees. I mean, that's it. And I think there was another talk at Bioneers this year by Kim Stanley Robinson, who wrote Ministry for the Future and looked at a projection, several decades hence of how this might all unfold. But what he was saying was, which is my experience as well, is that at the very highest levels of society at this point, there is a sense of dread, of real fear. I mean, this is the sorcerer's apprentice writ large, you know. We have unleashed forces so far beyond our control. I mean, it's not even, it's, you know, a farce. May the farce be with you, I like to say. But so, you know, I think that's unfolding. I think that we have an intuitive somatic connection to Earth, to the cosmos, to, you know, to this energy field that we live in, whatever it may be. And, you know, PTSD is now permanent traumatic stress disorder. Everybody's feeling it on an intuitive level, if not on a conscious level. And, you know, my experience and what I'm witnessing is there is some kind of awakening going on a pretty large scale, both sort of practical, pragmatic, but also much more deeply felt in terms of, you know, who we are in this web of life, this great mystery. So I think all of that is going on, and education right now is just so paramount. And really from the grassroots to the canopy, you know, we need to be educating policymakers right now. And for example, we just launched a new project with Bioneers called Bioneers Learning, where we're doing very practical how-to workshops and trainings, and both interior and external, you know, in terms of doing the inner work as well as actual practical work in the world. But, you know, Penny Livingston, the permaculturalist, for example, I spoke, you know, with her and was kind of asking her, what would you like to do that you haven't been able to do? And she wants to hold Permaculture 101, how to think like a permaculturalist for politicians and policymakers, public servants. I mean, that's the level that we're at functionally. I don't think we're as far away from it. You know, objects may be closer than they appear, basically, at this point. And the other thing that I just would say, you know, there's a lot to talk about there, but I'll leave it at that. But the other point I just wanted to make is in any narrative, there's a question underlying it, which is who benefits. And if you go back to, you know, with Changing of the Gods, the film series, which features Rick Tarnas, Rick talks about the birth of the modern mind and how this mentality, this way of seeing the world, this cosmology really arose. And it's founded in separation. That's the fundamental delusion that has misguided everything that we're doing, that we're separate from nature, that we're separate from each other, that we're separate from the cosmos. So the living truth, as we all know, is the opposite of that. We are entirely, you know, part of this web of life, and a very active participatory one. It's a dynamic system. And that's actually a wondrous story. And I appreciated what you said earlier, Michael, about just being in nature, because this is, you know, Richard Liu's work on nature deficit disorder. And I mean, this is very, very real. Just the experience of nature is critically important for people. But in terms of who benefits, when you look at the scientific revolution, much of that was basically, you know, co-arose with the advent of capitalism, which is founded on othering. It's the commodification, objectification of, and, you know, sale of everything. Fire sale of planet Earth. That's one of the things I'm having a hard time sometimes wrapping my mind around, is these people are really insane. I mean, what do they think this is leading to? It's completely obvious, you know. And I think that there's also a very widespread awakening founded very much in inequality now, and how extreme the madness has become of this kind of feral acquisition. And so I think that's the other turning point that we're beginning to really see, you know, come forth, is a very different way of, you know, a very different set of values that's founded in life itself, in relationships, not in commodities, not in stuff. So anyway, we can go, that's a whole other, you know, we get into that discussion, but I think we can't separate this from the economics and the ideology of capitalism.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. I think I'd take a little bit different perspective on this. For me, it's impossible to be separated from nature, and I'll make my argument with my next idea here in a minute. I don't think that we're separated from nature at all. It's impossible, because we are ecological, and understanding that, really knowing how we're ecological, which is some of the things that we're presenting tonight. How are we ecological? And if you really get your flippers around that, then you understand, well, there's no way I can be separated from nature. But to your point, what I think that we are separated from is our sense of emotional connection, our sense of emotionality, you know, not feeling those kinds of relationships and connections. And emotions are huge. Feelings are huge. So we can think about things all day. We can imagine, we can envision, but developing our good animal senses and understanding how we actually are ecological. And what I mean by that is the very same planetary processes for how the planet works are the same processes for how we work. And that's my next idea in the sense of understanding energy exchange ecologically and psychologically. So I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. Understanding diversity processes. Diversity doesn't just happen. It's extraordinarily complex and numerous interactions. The participation that we have in decay and renewal cycles. We live and we die, but we can also work with that psychologically. Change. How are we a part of change? Evolution. How do we involve ourselves with evolution? So that's the fourth idea, the fourth thing that we study at Veritas Graduate Institute, the fourth process. And the fifth one is relationality. So when you work through all of those and really understand them ecologically, you develop an ecological literacy for how the planet works. When you work through them psychologically, you get a very different narrative making process of who you are as an ecological being and your responsibility in how we participate with these processes in everyday life, not just big events, but in everyday life. So that second idea we can talk about that I'm suggesting is to mature our ecological and psychological relationality, to mature our understanding and our relationship with planetary processes, meaning just what I said, how we understand energy exchange. And it seems to me if we really understood more about how the planet exchanges energy, we would understand a whole lot more about how we exchange energy through our narratives and our behavior, how we participate in diversity or not, how we open to psychological diversity, cultivate psychological diversity, or completely shut that down, how we participate in decay and renewal. In other words, psychologically composting bad narratives, destructive practices, and then evolving ourselves and changing narratives, behavior, and practices, which I think urges us to become more relational as opposed to just staying a social species. So that's the second idea, but let me just show an image real quick of what I'm talking about here. And I think that then we can open this up a little bit. So when I talk about energy exchange, that's just one example I'm going to use because we don't have time to go through all these processes, of course. The way, the planet exchanges energy all the time, whether it's photosynthesizing, chemosynthesizing, exchanging nutrients, toxins, what all organisms are always exchanging energy, but the planet in a large scale way is exchanging energy by movements of air and water around the planet. And the way that looks is actually a gorgeous image. This is our beautiful planet, our gorgeous home. And what we're looking at here are air currents. And if I turn the planet here, we can see, of course, that air is circulating around the planet in all forms of air currents. And it's the same if I turned on our water movement, I looked at ocean currents. So air and water are always being circulated around the planet. And of course, the process is to move warm and cold air and warm and cold water around the planet, which gives us climate zones. That's why there's different climate, as you all know, in different places around the planet. Now, my image here is how we also circulate narratives. We circulate our narratives in our family, in our social systems, in our cultural systems. We circulate narratives in our businesses, our institutions. And those narratives can be opening and closing. They can be nutritious and toxic. They can be inclusive or exclusive. But it's the same kind of process that we can affect the entire organization, institution, policy making. All of this goes into the narrative that we're circulating in that particular situation or particular example. So I like to use this image to educate us a little bit about these large scale movements, but also to think about it psychologically, that circulating a narrative is not a small issue. It's not a small deal. It's enormous if you circulate toxic narratives. And of course, we're experiencing that not just in the United States, but in countries around the world where these toxic kinds of narratives are being spewed. Those matter because even if it's a socio-political narrative that you're trying to exclude people from voting or preventing women from having authority over their own bodies, those kinds of narratives are absolutely related to the same narratives that would destroy a rainforest or pollute the ocean or denude the planet. So they're interconnected in that sense. So as large scale as it is moving air and water around the planet, it is significant in how we circulate our narratives. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, just one right at the end there. What you were saying about the narratives and the language of the narratives brought me to ask, what is the Earth's rhetoric?
Yeah.
And how does the Earth's rhetoric shift in the face of toxic narratives? And how is our species, and maybe this, and no, it's the species of the planet itself, morally wounded by these toxic narratives?
Yeah.
So that's, I'm thinking about the linguistic quality of the planet and where that might take us.
So Dennis, I actually find that a beautiful thought there. And I think we see it in the behavior of the planet. Everything has behavior. And that's another place where I think we tend to, we're not attuned to the planet having behavior, trees having behavior, microorganisms having behavior. We only think of behavior that coming from this human person, this human species. And I think we see what you're talking about by going out and taking our nature into nature and really listening, sensing, smelling, tasting, all these kinds of good, animal senses that are so underdeveloped in us, we start to see the behavior of the planet. And I think we start to hear its languaging. So a good example of that would be, at least for me, an example that comes to my mind when I hear you articulate that is when I see albatross choking on plastics. That is a behavioral response of suffering. And to feel that, to feel the suffering of the other, and I think that's what I'm trying to get at here is also, how do we feel the suffering of the planet? Because it's not a thing. It's not an organism. It's a multitude of systems. It's a multitude of ecosystems. It's a multitude of complex ecologies. And that sounds overwhelming. It sounds very big, but if you just go and sit in your backyard, you start to be able to observe, and you can learn this, it's a practice, to hear and witness planetary behavior.
You remind me when I designed a course in the Myth program on psyche and nature, one of the texts that I chose was, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. And what she did, Lori, is just what you said. She went out in her backyard where there was a stream running, and she realized everything that I need to know about nature is within 30 feet of my back door. And it's just a magnificent, lyrical, scientific study of nature.
Right. Yeah. And if we take that and if we take that into a study, and we don't have to become ecologists. Matter of fact, ecology is, kind of missing the mark because they still have mechanical language. Things are still mechanistic. And hopefully one day they'll change some of that language, that rhetoric. But if we take that and move that a little bit, shift that maybe a little bit, then we can learn about what we're seeing. So if I'm watching a tree, I could just be sitting there enjoying the tree. But if I understood what was happening, that tree was exchanging hormones, that it was actually, using the sun's energy and developing carbohydrates and sugars and taking those down to the roots. And, it's feeding the tree next to it, by the way, too, and, it's communicating with this one because it's got some insects biting on it. So it wants its neighbors to know, hey, there's a herbivore attacking me. We actually then become very literate as to what's going on around us. We become attuned to our world. And when we're attuned ecologically, then we're attuned psychologically, we're attuned relationally, and that's where the emotion and the feeling come in. So thank you for that, Dennis. That's beautiful.
Yeah. And Lori, I'd like to jump in because this is something I spend a lot of my days thinking about. And I'll give you one example. You know, we worked on the film The Cove a few years ago. Talk about despair, and it won the Academy Award. And Oprah dedicated an entire show to it. And it was just, more coverage, but it was also a very difficult film to watch, especially the last 5 minutes. So, I mean, and now it's funny, now we're working on a host of films, like we're working on a film right now with a studio, and it's called Wild Hope. And the president of the studio is empathetic. He is absolutely resolute that he wants to focus on showing positive stories, positive narratives about solutions and about biodiversity. And we're also working on a film with Jimmy Chin, the Academy Award-winning filmmaker from Free Solo, just did a beautiful film called Wildlife, different title, Different Wild, which showcases the story of Doug and Chris Tompkins, who they founded Bioneers in North Face and moved to Patagonia and bought all this land and gave it back, just gave it all back. So I'm noticing that these narratives where people were like, the Cove is very important. One of the most important films I've ever worked on. We showed it at Congress. I've worked on Cartella. We've worked on these, but it seems now that the people are insane. I've had so many people come up to me after these events. Thank you for showing a positive message and a positive narrative. Like watching the dolphins, you know what I mean? So I don't know if it's kind of translating, but just having this narrative that's a little bit more positive and a little bit more focused on solutions instead of the despair.
Right. I think although there's no balance in the ecological world, but I'm going to use that term in quotes, that, the balance here is to try to augment ugliness with beauty, destructive with, constructive, if you will. And I think that's important because I know my students, when they're working through these processes, by the time you get to decay and renewal, you are in the thick of psychological composting, and it is not the most pleasant place to be, because you really are getting a sense of how a destructive narrative, for example, I don't matter, I'm not good enough. Well, if you don't matter, the rainforest doesn't matter, the ocean doesn't matter, the albatross doesn't matter, your next door neighbor doesn't matter. And so when you start to break that down by a lot of questioning, a lot of inquiry, and getting into how that narrative has lived you out in a lot of different situations, you're in the muck of it. And so I'm always encouraging students to get out and enjoy the sunset, find beauty, go to the river, sit by the ocean, whatever it is that, inspires and lifts the soul, in a sense, because you're doing deep work. You're shedding old narratives. You're putting them in a composting process. And all of you know that is not a pretty process. It's a very stinky, dying, rotting, putrefying process. And life can stink sometimes, just like it can in the compost pile. I think that for me is as important to be able to hold as going to the solutions, going to the beauty, going to where we feel inspired and moved and are in awe of a shared world. Those are equally important, I think, because if we just go to one, we negate the other, no matter which way it is. And some people just go to all the negative, as you were saying there. That's too heavy too. And that doesn't serve anything. It's not shifting anything, just to stay stuck in the negative. But then, how do we learn to hold the tensions of multiplicity, not just the tensions of opposites? There's a whole lot more going on than that, but to hold the tensions of multiplicity when you're going through a narrative change. And those in the audience who are probably predominantly mythologists know that when you let go of an old myth and move toward a new myth, that interim ground, like, the fields, the springs, these are tricky areas to be in. Anything can happen at the crossroads, right? So we've got, and we'll get to this in a minute when we talk about, changing these kinds of narratives. But it's so important to be able to bring beauty in with the ugliness. Hannah Arendt talked about that, with the ugliness of violence. And I think a lot of times she was misinterpreted or misunderstood about what she was trying to say with that. But, and by the way, can I just say, I love your films. I use them in our school all the time. I think they're extraordinarily important and educational on what we're talking about here.
Thank you so much. That's really thoughtful. It helps me. It's something that I grapple with daily. So
Yeah.
very helpful to me. Thank you.
Yeah.
Lori, if I could, you took us a little bit to the individual dark side. I'd like to take us just for a minute to the large scale dark side. About, you asked the question about how do we deal with toxic narratives? And Kenny, you raised the point that it seems like some people are literally insane when they think everything is for sale, including the future of our living environment. Well, the studies actually demonstrate that sociopaths have a higher propensity to be senior executives in businesses.
Yeah.
Senior political, the concentration of sociopathic narcissistic behavior is higher than the general population when you get into our leadership.
Mhm.
We all know that there are self-serving toxic narratives out there. But I think you're absolutely right when you say that nature, life itself, teaches us what to do about this. Because if you think about it, when you look at the behavior in tribes and flocks, et cetera, we tend to follow the strongest. There tends to be a leader setting a direction. And sometimes those leaders, in human terms, may not be setting the best direction.
Right.
And so what do you really do about that? What is the actual cure for that? Well, interestingly enough, while they're othering suffering away and saying, well, that suffering really doesn't count, those people deserve it, they don't work hard, blah, blah, whatever their lesson is, or we don't care about that fish, or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the lack of respect disarms that leader. The lack of, we're just not following that person. There is a behavior that disarms, and it does in nature as well. When it's not leading to our survival, we're not following. And I think that's one of the things that we need to allow ourselves to see clearly and use the model of nature for how does nature actually work and survive? Yeah, there's prey and they're predators. How do they survive together in the world? And I think we can bring those lessons into our society.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right about that, Michael. I agree 100%. The way that we untangle or detangle toxic narratives or detrimental narratives is to work through these processes. Because if you don't understand the energy being exchanged from that narrative, you really don't know what's happening there. And it's also not easy to observe. It's, we're learning to see what's not so obvious, hear what's not always being said, smell what's very difficult to, sniff out. And so working through ecological energy exchange and looking at that, how the narrative is exchanging energy, how the narrative is opening and cultivating diversity, or that narrative absolutely shuts psychological diversity down. And we could go through each of these processes, all 5 of them, and look at how when we don't understand them, we know so little about then who we are in relation to others. It busts this human individualism that we're just an individual self walking across the planet with hobnail boots, instead of, living with a shared planet that everything has behavior and agency, and what we think and do and how we behave matters for other materials, for other matters, right? For other organisms and life forms. The word organism feels, I don't like that word, but life forms, other life forms in that sense. So I'm right with you on that. But I do think we need to understand the ecology of that, because it's not that we're drawing from metaphors. There's certainly a plethora of metaphors that we can pull from ecology and ecological workings, but they're also extraordinarily psychological. And I say that because we are ecological, then the metaphors and processes that we're working with psychologically, it's almost like you're working organically. We get what's happening with that river system. We get when we come up against a log jam. We get when our anger explodes like a volcano, rather than trying to understand, well, you know, what happened when you were 5 or 7 or 3. It's important to go back and track those narratives back to their origins, but you can absolutely examine them through each of these processes, and what you end up knowing about yourself and how you end up changing the narrative, the image that holds it in place changes the behavior, which then changes the practice. We do differently. And that's what our focus is really narrative change in that sense, because it seems to me that if we want to nudge along different narratives, in other words, in my language, I would say, if we want to participate in psychological evolution, then we need to know what we're doing and what narratives we are nudging along, and how to change detrimental narratives to nudge along different ones. Otherwise, practices won't change. You're just changing a habit. You're just sort of moving the leaf litter around a little bit and not really getting into the root system and pruning off roots that no longer feed the tree.
You know, I think one of the characteristics that can counter the force and attractions of narcissism is leading into other things that we're talking about next week, called gratitude. And as we show gratitude and express gratitude for the world that we live in, we break the cycle of narcissism. We stop reinforcing the idea of a separate self. We connect with what John Powell talks about is othering. And it's this I am because we are. We are a collective unit that thinks itself. And when we do that, we start trusting that that's actually a good thing to do. We behave more intuitively. We stop using the rational mind and we start coming from the heart. And when we start doing that, our behaviors change. Doors open in front of us. Paths open where there were no paths before. And so instead of following a path that has previously gotten us there, and a lot of that comes through pattern behaviors, languages, trainings in schools, these are the things that if we can overcome and transform our patterns of narcissism, we can change the world, because we change the world by changing ourselves.
One other piece, and I'm completely with and in this conversation completely. But and here I'm going to reveal something of my own personal myth, is that for me, spirituality is nourished and enriched by any connection with the natural order. Even if it's walking in this rural area here about 40 miles north of San Antonio, when I walk in the morning, it's a spiritual journey as much as it is anything else. And the birds are in the chorus and they're singing on trees on both sides of the road, and the armadillos and the foxes and wild turkeys. I mean, it's just a rich menagerie that Sandy and I live in here, and we never take it for granted. But it elicits that spiritual hunger, and it feeds the spiritual hunger to be out in the greenery of nature. So it's just another layer of this conversation.
You know, Dennis, I have students ask a lot, well, you know, I know we're studying some of the ecology and the psychology, but where is eco-psychology spiritual? You know, it's an interesting question, and it always takes me aback when I hear that. And for me, I don't understand how it could not be. How could it not be when you are in relationship to, the splendor of this planet, whether it's, biogeochemical cycle or an elephant or a coyote that runs across your path. I don't see how it could be otherwise.
I want to jump on the word that Dennis used, granary, and Dana was talking about gratitude, and they both have the same prefix, GRA, which is the prefix for grail, for green. And I think there's something there. If you look at Steiner talks about the consciousness that you should cultivate if you want to be initiated into the higher levels of spirituality. It starts by cultivating an energy of gratitude, a consciousness of gratitude. And I think that gratitude does create, fundamentally, to be grateful for something, you're putting your own consciousness or your value system outside of yourself. You're being grateful for something else. And I think that when it comes to that decentralization that you're looking for, I've been talking about and leading us towards these GRA words, I think there's something to them: the grain, the grass, the grail, the gratitude. Gratitude as grail. Grail, of course, representing also the feminine in a major way. The source of femininity is the source of birth and everything that is born, and that overflowing abundance of life. So I don't know, I just wanted to seize on that, on the two of you bringing up these two keywords, gratitude and granary, and suggest that maybe there's something special, maybe there is some grail there in gratitude in the granary.
Well, they're finding out actually that gratitude heals. You're healthier by having an attitude or philosophy of gratitude. And not only is it good for the self, but it's good for the planet. And it is one of those things that as you become generous in giving and feeling and expressing gratitude, it actually has a beneficial physical effect upon us. And they're practicing this. A guy named Emmons. Well, Corinne, you can say more about this, but I mean, it's phenomenal how giving something actually gets you something. And it's not that you do it for the reward or the benefit, but it's a consequence of it. Because everything that we do is acted out in a holistic kind of a way. It has a context. And when we think of ourselves in a context, we don't hurt the thing that we feel a part of. If we feel a part of something, we treat it with love and respect and a way that produces beneficial effects.
That was Plato's argument for why to be moral. There's you, there's the universe, and the three parts of yourself. One of the parts of yourself is fundamentally a mixture of yourself with everything. And so how could you be immoral towards the world when you yourself, part of yourself, is a mixture of yourself with everything?
Yes,
Yeah.
but it was also Plato that gave us the meaning of soul, which was absolutely divorced from planet, from creativity, from, emotion. So I think, I take Plato with a grain.
He does do the total divide of reality. And with that divide, he then participates in the long-standing degradation of the material and the recognition of matter as dead, the particles as dead, Earth as dead. And of course, that's where Dr. Tarnas picks up, and he says all of Western consciousness is focused on this idea of everything is separate, but leads to a vision of matter as separate, which leads to a vision of matter as dead. And once you see matter as dead, how do you treat it as living? And so that's kind of, in some ways, what we're trying to get ourselves out of, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. So, just finishing up this idea of what we were looking at here is how these ecological overarching processes of energy exchange and diversity as a process, decay and renewal, change, evolution, relationship really are not only just ecological processes, they are psychological processes. And really working those and understanding those and moving through that narrative matures, I think, at least from my experience of teaching this for so many years, matures our human childlike narrative with the planet. And we've had many planetary narratives. Carolyn Merchant writes about that beautifully in her book, The Death of Nature, where, we've had different narratives of the planet and the way that we understood the planet, whether it was mechanical or organism or clockwork, however, the way we treated it as such. But the issue with that is that the way that we understood the planet and treated it was also the way that we understood other humans and treated them, which of course that hierarchical system has gotten us into all kinds of nasty, ugly behaviors. And we're also looking at this shifting of maturing this childlike narrative of the planet we have today, meaning to not discontinue, if you will, to treat the earth as if it were simple, as if it were predictable, stable. There's nothing stable about climate. There's nothing stable about the planet. Passive object, that the planet is somehow taking revenge on all of us with all of its, on us unruly humans with its superstorms, its atmospheric rivers. And if we understood that the planet, this kind of goes to Dennis's thing about language, the planet has long-term processes. It's in it for the long game. And its behavior and its articulation is of long-term processes. Whereas we humans are really stuck in this short-term vision. We place a lot of priority on vision as opposed to developing our other sense capacities. When we can't smell something, when we can't feel something, when we can't sense the pressure of something, we might just rely on what we can see. And as some of you mentioned when we first started, what we see right in front of us might be all that we do see. And that's a very limited, scope of understanding right there. So any final thoughts on ecological processes, developing psychological processes? Yeah.
Just one fun thing. You mentioned the difference between weather and climate being short-term and long-term. Well, in storytelling, in story structure, there's a difference between emotion and mood. And a character's emotion is something that's temporary, but the mood is like the same thing, only when it becomes core to what that character is long-term. And I couldn't help but make the connection between climate and weather.
Well, yes. And don't we feel that? I mean, we go out in the cold and there's a mood that comes over us, or if when we're in cold, rainy weather, there's a mood. If we're out in the sun or we're by the ocean, there's a mood that goes with that. I think that's absolutely a great connection. Yeah. Thank you, Will. Yeah. Bringing in all these rich roots to our conversation, everyone. Thank you. So our next idea is, and of course, these ideas are, again, just giving us some things to consider, to circumambulate. But our next idea is to make an educated move out of innocence and ignorance, right? So ignorance meaning nothing to do with, intelligence or any of that. Ignorance meaning to ignore. And there's a subtle difference to ignore, to choose not to see, than something that's just not known yet, not discovered yet. So making this move from innocence and ignorance, which really, if we think about that, we can no longer choose to ignore how the earth works, which is an underdeveloped ecological literacy. We can no longer make policies, develop our businesses, imagine new products if we don't take in an ecological literacy, because everything that we do in those areas, in our industry, in our institutions, are going to affect planetary processes and other, non-humans. So we can no longer ignore how the earth works. So developing this underdeveloped ecological literacy, which is what Kenny was mentioning earlier, learning about the earth's anatomy, its physiology, its psychology. Now, what does that mean? It means understanding how the earth behaves, its relationality, and learning about its history, so that, it's looking at a lot of different areas, not just ecology, but biology, geology, evolutionary developmental ecology, which are all fascinating areas. But in eco-psychology, or ecological psychology, like I like to call it that, because it is an ecological psychology, we pull from all these areas to try to educate ourselves about who and what we are in that sense. So if we're at a place that I think this panel probably would agree that we can no longer choose to remain innocent and ignorant of intradependency. What might that mean to you? How would you speak to that? And I'm using the word intradependency here, not interdependency. And the word intra is interesting. I use it in intradependency and intra-actions because it's kind of a quantum physics pull. But the idea with an intradependency is with intra, you're leaving space for something to happen. You're opening space in an interaction for something to happen. So it's not predictive. It's not deterministic, right? So that's how I'm using intradependency, that our interdependence on the planet, there's some space there for things to emerge, to happen that aren't predictive and aren't deterministic, which is a really, imaginal way of living and understanding. But it also, I think, keeps us in a spirit of awe and wonder.
And I wonder if we could add, and I wonder, and that was just completely unconscious, and that's why it's true. David Bohm wrote a beautiful book called On Dialogue.
Yeah.
And he said, what he learned about an authentic conversation was that it had no end point. It had nothing to solve. It didn't have an agenda. Two people or group of people begin a conversation like this. Now, Lori, you're leading us. I mean, you're keeping it moving. But within that, you create this space where we can bring in what seems suitable or relevant from where we're seeing and from what we're believing. So I think this is an example of this panel of what a conversation can be, so enriching because it doesn't have necessarily an end game.
Yeah, it's mulchy. It's a very mulchy conversation.
I like that. Beautiful.
Any thoughts, Kenny?
Well, I mean, I'm still thinking about some other things, but along the lines of what I think you're asking. I mean, I've worked in this arena, so when stories change, the world changes, right? I think we're all probably in agreement about that. Much of the kind of mythos or cosmology that we're talking about is not new, actually. It's ancient. It's alive in many places around the world. I certainly, we started Bioneers in 1990. Over this time, I've seen a massive shift in consciousness, and it's accelerating quite dramatically right now. So I have to come back to the politics, because this is not just about changing the story. That's fine. But it'll just become a limited series, and that'll be the end of that. So what we really have to do is have a call to action and actually translate these stories into behavior change. You may not ultimately change somebody's point of view or their mind in a certain sense, but we can change people's behavior, and that's why we have societies and regulations and laws and agreements and and so forth. So I think we're talking about two different things. I think there's also certainly the work that we do with Bioneers is integrated in that sense. These stories are parables or actual living examples of what this next world looks like for real. It's here now. The future is here right now for real, and it's growing. And those stories are highly practical. I mean, we've had one person, who's I'm a big admirer of, Bren Smith, who developed 3D ocean farming. And they can use a tiny amount of vertical water space in the ocean near the coast to grow massive amounts of seaweeds, basically, of which there are 300 kinds we've never eaten, and shellfish, and you create localized economies that actually distribute wealth and build community wealth. However, it's now pretty well established that kelp is massive for carbon sequestration. So spawning these kinds of 3D ocean farms around the world, which would be one of the easiest things that we could possibly do and quick, would have a huge effect on carbon sequestration. And also, when you feed kelp to cows, it reduces their methane emissions by 90%. I mean, that's just one example of countless stories, but that's a call to action. There's a difference. I mean, we're facing our own extinction here. This is all very real. It won't be like the movie Don't Look Up, where it's in the blink of an eye, an asteroid wipes you out. It's going to be a long, protracted, agonizing, decline. So it's not like you can just walk away and say, I'm despairing. That's not the way it works. And you, at the very beginning, Laura, you raised one question, which is something I talked a long time ago about with Janine Benyus, but there's a really fundamental question that we ought to be asking. How does nature heal? Right? This is about regeneration. We have a very depleted planet right now. Understanding how to work with nature to help nature heal. That's really the gig in a lot of ways at this point. And it all originates from a frame of healing. There's a lot of healing to do. We are damaged. The planet is damaged. They're not separate. There's good reasons for all this. And I think, regenerative farming is another really great example, and building natural capital at all kinds of levels, which I'm sure you're, most familiar with. But we need to be not just educating people, but actually moving them into action and offering pathways for that. And I think, having come of age in the 60s, I would have to say that I think that the generation gap today is greater than even in the 60s.
Yep.
There is an existential understanding of how off track the civilization is. And their lives are fully ahead of them. They've got a long way to go, hopefully. And this is, and it's one of many issues that are interrelated, including inequality and exploitation. And, the labor movements that we're seeing now are virtually unprecedented in this country. It's certainly in many, many years. So these are all co-arising at the same time. And the more that they can recognize their intra-connection, because I agree with you, there's a magic that happens. It's like in a personal relationship, there's you, there's me, and there's the between. There's the dynamic that occurs that's actually a third party in a sense that comes from that relationship. And that's the kind of magical space that I think it's incumbent upon all of us to be raising up now and offering conditions that are conducive to those opportunities, so that people can participate, can learn, can get connected, and people are hungry for community. We're social creatures. That's been one of the worst tragedies of COVID, especially for young people, is the isolation and the disconnection. It's crippling, and it retards growth in a very little sense. It diminishes your humanity. So anything that builds community in these kinds of ways and gets people working together. But I don't want to go on any longer, but just the last thing I'd say is this is about politics. There's no escaping it. This is about power. Majorities of the public are in favor of virtually everything that probably most people on this call and in this audience would agree with. And among young people, it's just 2/3 to 3/4. I mean, across virtually every issue around progressive values. So there's a democracy deficit. That's the problem. And, we've got to be addressing that, or the rest of this to me is commentary, to be blunt.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your bluntness. And I think, one of the things when I thought about this, putting some of these ideas together, was certainly for me in ecological psychology, can't just be ecology and psychology. Ecology has never and will not solve our problems, nor will or has psychology. So it is a social, ecological, psychological, economical, issue here that we're talking about. These are interdependent narratives. And I use the word narrative specifically. I don't use the word story. I think there is a bit of a difference there. Like a difference with a myth is different than a story, different than a narrative. I see the narratives as bedrock. They underpin all of the behaviors that you're actually talking about in these different circles, in these different venues. But I do think that we need to be educated about that and what we bring into those mixes. Otherwise, we're not going to know what we're doing or how to communicate effectively or to bring about those kinds of policy changes that you're pointing to. That's where, narrative work for me, or really being able to change the behavior, to change the practices, to change the policies, the procedures is critical. Otherwise, I absolutely agree with you. Then what are we doing here?
Well, the other thing, and I've talked with Linn about this a bit because of the changing of the gods film and Rick's work around, it's not so much about the astrology, really is about the archetypes and different psychological mindsets or archetypal forces, and I think we live in an age of micro-targeting, and that's not all bad in a certain way. Different stories appeal to different people. There's different hooks that will draw people in. Much of it depends on culture, on lineage, the burdens of history, where you come from, where you live. I mean, those things really matter. The Land Institute, which was founded by Wes Jackson in Kansas, did a study in Kansas, I think about 10 years ago, of why people were so opposed to renewable energy and couldn't talk about climate change. And what they found in the research was that it was an identity issue. And it was very brilliant what they did. They then went and looked at, well, what is the identity that's behind that? So, you know, and basically, you know, if you're into climate change, you're into abortion, you're into, you know, gun control, it was a whole kind of gestalt of different characteristics.
Yeah.
So one thing they found out about Kansans is that they're very, very frugal. So they position clean energy, renewable energy, as being very economical and frugal. You can actually save money, right? Your electric bills can go down. And they went through this list of what the characteristics were. And one of the latter very interesting things was that Siemens, the corporation, came in and built a large wind power plant. And suddenly there were thousands of jobs. And once people had jobs working in that industry, jobs that they felt good about, that they actually felt were contributing something, that were not destructive, that was giving them a living wage, their entire attitude changed.
Yeah.
So this is where shifting to a green economy, I mean, many people feel left behind because they have shit jobs. You know, the gig economy, they know they're being scammed and ripped off and exploited and then thrown out the window, and, you know, on and on. So having jobs that you feel good about, that pay you a living wage, that you're actually contributing to a positive future, completely changes the narrative just in and of itself. And I think in many red parts of the country, that is going to be one of the game changers, actually.
Yeah.
Can I add a comment to that? If you study tipping points, what causes a market to shift dramatically? What you find out is there's always a group that are people identify with who are the opinion setters. Maybe it's a group of actresses who are seen as very chic, or maybe it's, you know, leaders here, by the way, in Alabama. I can talk to hunters and fishermen about conserving the environment, and they'll actually talk to me about that. So if we spread this knowledge, okay, and I think education's the fundamental answer, and if we can get people who are already opinion leaders in those areas to begin to popularize in the way they know how to do it, farmers talking to farmers about it, right? Not academics pushing them. But I also agree with what Martin Luther King said. What we know is that history shows us privilege is never given up willingly by the privileged. So it's not, there's like three layers here. There are people who want to be progressive, who see the opportunities and see the needs. There are people over here who have a vested interest that are going to fight it. So at the end of the day, I can't agree more that it's got to be political. You know, ultimately, we've got to get the political changes over here forced through our society. But I think we do it by leadership that comes out of the different elements of the society, and people believe what their friends tell them. So as we start to share the narrative and make it almost ridiculous that somebody doesn't understand, we're really better off if we don't have to pay for fuel every day, if we can get it free every day. That's why the Chinese have spent more money on renewable energy than America has. The reason they do it is they know it's a competitive advantage. Why do I want to pay for fuel? Once we can get leaders within those groups talking about it, we can create the political pressure to force the change.
Yeah. I agree with both Michael and Kenny on this. I mean, for me, ecological psychology has to have an activist root system. My life has been in activism, and so I guess I teach it from that perspective too. But I also see education as a call to action. If you're being educated in a particular way, especially, you know, ecologically and relationally wise, then you are being called to a response. You're learning to be able to respond differently, you know, to these challenges, whether, you know, as opposed to just responding or not responding in the same old way. And responsiveness is really huge for me, I think, in trying to shift these narratives, developing responsiveness, skills, knowledge of how to reconfigure narratives and behaviors and changing those practices and policies that perpetuate the rupturing of our climate systems or land and aquascapes, or ultimately participating in an untimely extinction. Really becoming ecologically and psychologically responsive is becoming responsible. That to me is a call to action. It's not a passive becoming responsive,
Right.
So in that sense, I can't sit with the knowledge that I have or the understanding or the feelings or emotions that I have and not be active or take action in certain areas that I have a concern about, which in the environment is a lot. Else we continue to participate in ecocide, genocides, culturecides. So, it's hard to form sometimes, I think, relationships with what we don't understand, to feel we belong on this planet and with this planet, to feel we live among kin. It's a different way of thinking for us humans in that sense. And I do take that into our organizations and institutions because they're ecologies too. So feeling and thinking with others, feeling and thinking like a rock, like a mountain, like a river, like an ocean. We know these ideas, these are old ideas, but also feeling, the suffering of others, the suffering of the planet. If we don't feel that, it's not really going to mean that much. We might see it and it might register and we might do something different temporarily, but is there a complete metamorphosis of your practice? Is there a complete metamorphosis of your behavior? And that's where I get to, working with really shifting the narratives around these particular areas. So we can ask, as an ecological being, how do we participate in climate shaping? How are we shaped and how do we shape? Not that we're one with, but how do we participate in this co-shaping and being shaped by? And I just want to throw out a couple of thoughts on that. And I know that this particular panel is all versed in this, but I'm really trying to also bring ideas to our audience as well. How are we of climate processes that when we think about it, doesn't have to be so big and existential and out there. They're very much a part of our everyday living and breathing. They're not external. We're not detached from them. Climate processes aren't things. They're processes, they're movements. So one of the ways that we can understand that is to understand that we are also a part of biogeochemical cycles, meaning water. We're a part of water. Certainly our body is 60% or so of water, but also we're water dependent. We're carbon dependent. That's a part of the biogeochemical cycles, the exchange of carbon. We're nitrogen dependent. We're sulfur dependent. We shed our skin every day. We're phosphorus dependent. We have bones and our teeth are dependent on that. So we're elementally dependent. We are like other life forms, trees and insects and microbial organisms. We're elementally dependent. And so the things that we do, the way that we think, the policies that we make, the activities that we engage in affect those cycles. Then in turn, directly, we're affecting our own lives. We're affecting our own well-being or the well-being of our organization or our community. We are of the atmosphere. We are not the atmosphere, we're of it. With every breath we take, we inhale oxygen, we exhale CO2, which our trees take up. And we have a very intimate relationship with vegetation in that sense. So, we're of the biosphere. It's where we live. It's where we create our communities, our businesses. It's where we die, unless you're an astronaut, perhaps. We're of the hydrosphere. I just mentioned that. We're water dependent. We're the lithosphere, which is a very interesting idea to think about, especially when we think about our relationship with death. And ultimately, for me, ecological psychology encourages us to develop a relationship with death. Learning how to die psychologically, composting detrimental narratives and behaviors, and reconfiguring those and putting those through a metamorphic process to do differently, imagine differently, construct and design and develop differently. So we're a part of these planetary processes and certainly these interconnected spheres. So if we imagine that image I showed earlier, the circulation of air and water, we're also looking at circulation of biogeochemical cycles, of which we are a part of. So whether we live in one part of the planet doesn't mean that we're not connected to other parts of the planet, or what we do in our little home or our little community does not affect other communities, other homes, other non-human and human beings. It does. So I'm curious what the panel thinks about that. And then we're going to go to Kenny's thing about what can we do, the call to action.
You know, one of the most interesting things right now, I think, I don't know, you tell me if this is following along the thread that you're on here, but one of the most powerful things going on that I'm witnessing now is the rights of nature movement. And this really, in earnest, began in 2006 here in this country. It's now the fastest growing environmental movement in history. And with Bioneers, we work particularly with tribes, where it's in the US, where it's now really about to pop in a big way. But it flips the paradigm completely from nature as property to nature as a person. And even the idea of personhood at large. I mean, why is a corporation a person and nature is not? I mean, something is very wrong with that picture. You know, women were not persons. Obviously, slaves and African Americans were not persons. So it raises very interesting question about what is a person, and the kinds of things that you were saying before, because we're an interbeing and an intra-being both. You know, we're, you know, co-creating one another all the time. It's a dynamic process. But I think that's one of the most interesting storylines that we're able to follow. And one of the native lawyers that we worked with made a very ironic comment with, you know, whether or not we recognize nature's rights. Nature is in charge and is going to exercise her rights whether we like it or not. So get used to it, you know, wake up to it. And Tom Lindsay and Maury Margot, who have spearheaded a lot of this work, last year got the 30th largest county in the country to pass a rights of nature ordinance. This was Orange County, no less, in Florida, home of Orlando and Disney World, right? Not exactly a progressive community. I mean, it's, you know, very red area. So it was a right to clean water initiative. Water is a huge problem, and it's wildly polluted from all the agribusiness and everything else going on, and now climate disruption, you know, so and people can stand as trustees on behalf of the waters. But it not only, they got it as a popular initiative on the ballot, so it was a direct vote by the people. It not only passed, it passed with 89% of the vote, okay? And Tom told me they, you know, did a lot of organizing on the ground, you know, shoes leather, and they went to houses where in the window was a right to clean water initiative sign, and on the lawn was a Trump sign. Okay. So I mean, these issues transcend the left-right binary nonsense, you know, which is often just a mystique. And I think, anyway, I think that going to this, getting away from nature as property to nature as a living being is the start of the kind of yellow brick road, you know.
I just want to add to what you're, you know, we talked about our codependence or co-emergence from nature, from and with nature. And you mentioned that 75% of younger generations tend to show more liberal values. And I want to turn to one of the reasons that is because we've grown up inside of that reality so much more. And my students even more than I have. And so, of course, you know, that's just what they're eating and drinking. And of course, part of why we're talking today is because of how much anxiety that has created. And you mentioned it's not post-traumatic stress, it's permanent traumatic stress. But one of the things I think is also really interesting in this codependence with nature is also the codependence of science with nature, where science did build around this understanding of us as separate from the world, and this vision of reality as separate. It then went and built a whole ton of technologies based on that scientific understanding that we see in the industrial age. And all those technologies reinforce a materialistic, you know, a piece of iron used as a train track is dead matter. So all of that is reinforcing the relationship with matter and nature is dead. But unfortunately for science and for that perspective, there's a codependence between science and nature. And eventually science destroyed, you know, the map eventually gets to be a better and better and better map trying to emulate the land. And eventually science couldn't continue to reinforce this idea of everything is separate. And it broke, you know, quantum mechanics have been mentioned, dependent co-arising, all these different new understandings of science that broke that paradigm have become new technologies. And these new technologies are the world that my generation and generations after me live in. I live in a world of Twitters and Instagram. There's no centralization in social media. So why would I be stuck in centralization? I wasn't born into the technologies that are so focused on centralization. So in some ways, that I think that's one of the very encouraging things. It's not just that the narratives change, it's that the narratives beneath all of that is even our science and our relationship with nature as we understand it. Then that translates into our narratives, translates into our technologies, translates into our conditioning, and becomes our thought processes. And by now there's basically a tidal wave of youth that does not think in terms of centralization and objectification.
Well, maybe. I mean, I think we have to think about who we say when we, I mean, you're talking about a particular generation, a male of a certain age in that generation. And, students that I teach of your age and younger still are taught. They're taught in the academy, these binary ways of thinking. They are taught to be segmentified in particular ways of thought. So there's probably a lot of that. There's both, in the sense of
that's a hangover, I think.
The new generation coming in might be glued to their, handy technologies, but psychologically or relationally, they're still struggling with, relationships with family, relationships with community, where they belong, their identity, all of that. And so, there's no simple solution here. We're not presenting that in any case anyway, but the plethora of ideas and commentary that are brought, and I'm really kind of speaking to the audience here in this sense, to take all of this mulchiness, if you will, into consideration when you're kind of figuring out where you are in the mix. And, what's important to you? Do you know what you value? Do you know what's important to you? Do you know what matters? And certainly the way that we think about ourselves and others in the planet matters for then how we will treat ourselves, others, and the planet. The policies that we develop or the practices that we develop will come from those ideas, those thoughts. So we're trying to present some different ideas to stir that up for everybody. So very much appreciate these different root systems coming in, these different threads. Corinne, any thoughts from you? I see you're shaking your head there.
Oh, yes, it's just also rich and wonderful. I just want to do a shout out to Bioneers because they're just so amazing. If you want the antidote to eco-grief, spend 3 days at Bioneers, and their work of rights of nature is just second to none. It's visionary. The women that they have leading some of those programs, shout out, you know who I'm talking about, Kenny, including Nina. I just came back, and it took me 2 weeks before my feet even touched the ground. It was so inspiring. And Michael was with me. I dragged Michael. I told him he had to come. But anyways, Dennis, you always teed me up as you always do. You're a plant, right? Because speaking of David Bohm, I worked on that film Infinite Potential, based on David Bohm's work. And when I took it on, I said, well, this will be interesting. I'd love to do a science film about oneness. And the best response I got was from environmentalists who were saying to me, if you can get this film across to people, they will see that we're all one with the universe. It's based on Bohm's principle of we're all one, and they'll realize we're one with nature. And I said, I never looked at this as an environmental film. Well, they were right. And I'll tell you something else. I thought, I've worked on a lot of films in my life, and I said 7 people are going to come see this film, including the director's mother, if I'm lucky. Okay, because, oh, hey, do you want to go see a Marvel movie, or do you want to see a movie about David Bohm proving quantum physics that we're all one? Well, I've never been more wrong in my life. It's one of the most successful films we ever worked on. We did one night screenings with 30 and 40,000 people. We did a screening online one night, and we crashed our system. So this is a film about David Bohm. Okay, so anyways, just to tell you the hunger for this, and if you get the right narrative, and if you get the right messaging, even if it is a physics film. So anyways, Dennis, like I said, you teed me up, and Kenny, you teed me up with that great rights of nature work, and those are my thoughts.
Thank you for that. Infinite Potential is the film.
That's the name of the film. We screened it here. Right. Well, yeah, with the director, we talked the director into getting up at like 2 a.m. London time to do that was harder than this marketing the film. Anyways, he was brilliant. It was amazing. He's pretty amazing.
Thanks.
It's such a great title too, right?
Beautiful.
And his work is, I love his work. I think it's so interesting because in this idea of oneness, there is multiplicity, the plurality in that. And I think some people stop at, well, we're one with nature, we're one with the planet, we're one with, whatever, which is a naive way of thinking about, who and what we are in a multiplicitous planet. So that's what I think quantum physics brings out so beautifully. But gosh, it's all in the title. Let's bring this to a close because I know our time is getting short. And one of the things that the task was tonight was to share with our audience some of the things that we can do. And I'll just toss out a few, and I'm sure our esteemed panel have many more ideas. Kenny's already put out a bunch of ideas around that as well, but certainly reduce emissions and achieve a more rapid buildup of clean energy and flourishing economies. That means addressing capitalism on a big scale, stopping burning fossil fuels, and nations working together collaboratively to replace the kinds of machines that burn those kinds of fuels, and hopefully moving to other kinds of sources of energy. There's the idea of energy again, generating clean electricity if that's part of that, but also being attentive to our purchasing practices, materials, who and where they're made. The idea of consumer means waste. And if we knew that, we probably would not use that word. We're taught to be consumers. In other words, we're taught to be wasteful. So that's something to be alert to in just our daily, what we can do at home kind of thing. I think also, supporting infrastructure bills and repair, ameliorating projects that would counter the effects of extreme weather events, providing housing for certainly millions of climate refugees that are displaced in every country. But of course, also we need to address the effects of toxic socio-political narratives, behavior and practices, and those policies that cause extreme economic inequality, extreme practices toward each other and the environment. The idea that it's okay to leave billions of humans and non-humans without the resources they otherwise would have in their ability to cope with fast changing climate. But I also think being attuned to who you vote for and what you're voting for when you vote. Don't just, vote for the person, but really know who and educate yourself on that, know who and what you're voting for. Learning more about how we grow our food and our water, our air and our soil. But I think also importantly, and this is just sort of my little contribution, and we'll open this up to other contributions as well. I do think it's important to know who and what you are as an ecological participant, and not just as a social species, but urging and nudging us along to become a relational species. That's a difference. That's a big difference there. Developing that ecological literacy, cultivating psychological capacities and capabilities to reconfigure detrimental narratives that underpin these practices and behaviors. So you change the narrative, you change the behavior, you change the practice. We do things differently in that sense. We think differently, we feel differently. That means we change policies and practices that have been on the books for forever and are destructive. They're ugly. We develop an attunement. In other words, we give attention to mental, emotional, and physical needs of non-human and humans in stressful times, which we are in. Learn how to compost, in my language, human exceptionalism, supremacism, individualism, those toxic narratives underpinning planetary despoliation, and of course, this climate crisis. Becoming a psychological activist, if you will, meaning be creative in your activism. I know that not everybody likes to go march. I particularly love it, but I like those marches to end up in something, to bring about a change in something, not just go marching down the street with a sign and nothing comes of that. We've blown opportunity after opportunity in environmental activism where those marches have not resulted in change in policy or practice. So really learning how to psychologically compost these narratives and becoming more active in our participation. And we can do that creatively with art or performance or poetry or photography, storytelling, all these kinds of things. Become civic activists. In other words, knowing who runs your community in your city and being responsive to their practices and policies, whether they're ecosystemic and flourishing or not, and calling them on that, and really, urging those kinds of changes. I think that sometimes we feel hopeless and helpless because we're not moving that energy into an active participatory movement. And we can't sit back and hope someone else takes care of things. So to really step forward in that kind of civic activism, actively support ecosystemic policies. Don't get derailed by naysayers. We can always count on, the unconscious, if you will. We can always count on those people who are calcified in their particular stance or their particular ideology or belief system, and they're not going to change. But it only takes a small group, as you all know, to then nudge along different ways of being, different ways of thinking, different ways of feeling, different narratives, if you will. And don't fall prey to misinformation and worse, disinformation. Do your homework. Know what you're reading, know what you're hearing, know what you're taking in, because you're taking in information. Don't just believe it. Educate yourself about it. Take it apart. Look at it from different portals, different angles. Support circular economics. Really try to get involved in how you do that in your own home, in your own community. Attend Bioneers, attend Esalen film festivals, go to the Climate Bootcamp, go to trips with Dennis Slattery, attend Veritas Graduate Institute. We have degree programs and non-degree programs. We have intensive in eco-psychology, which is studying these processes we're talking about tonight. So we're all educators in one way or another, but we're not all participants, if you will. And I think, when we think about what we can do, it's really like, I'm going to follow Kenny on this, turning these ideas into an action and participating more fully in the world that we want, in the world that we're imagining, that we want right now, not in the future, but right now, thinking about it as that.
You mentioned this, Lori, but I'd like to put a spotlight on it. We are all members of multiple communities. We're members of our workplace, our homeowners association, perhaps a place of worship, a family. And I think the one thing we can do that is probably the most effective is to go be effective as change maker in the communities where we're already known, already respected. It requires me to recognize that ignorance is my own enemy. I have to deal with me internally to be effective at talking to an organization I'm part of. But that's the grassroots approach, and politics is always local. Mm-hmm. Being organized locally and building that community and building that common understanding locally creates power that does in fact move up politically, up the political chain to impact. So you talk about us being effective in marches. We need to be effective at all of the organizations we belong to, then embracing these issues.
Mm-hmm. Michael, I really appreciate you highlighting that, because, what you're getting under there is that idea that we're taking these big issues that seem overwhelming down into what we can do right now, right in front of us. And I think that's important. It helps us not get so anxiety ridden or fear based or overwhelmed by, well, these are such big issues. What can I do? Boy, folks, we can all do a lot. And it only takes a few of us collaboratively, cooperating, going out there and doing these kinds of things. But it doesn't mean you have to, go out and march if that's not your thing. Find other ways of being active in your community. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Thank you for attending tonight. I'm sure you have a lot to digest and chew on, but I hope that you do chew on what was discussed tonight by everybody, and do go to these Bioneers and these films and participate in ways that you can find in your community. Because if we don't do it, I don't know who else will. There is no one else.
I'd like to give a moment to Corinne to talk about gratitude and our theme for that really ties in with this. Next month, we have the unbelievable honor of having Louis Schwartzberg. Corinne, why don't you talk for just a moment about what's in store for us?
Great. Yeah. So this, when we were talking about this, Dana, I don't think we could have set this up more perfectly, because gratitude is just going to be a gorgeous follow-up to a brilliant evening. Lori, thank you so much. But basically, we haven't figured out the logistics of, we're going to screen the film, Louis Schwartzberg's latest film, Gratitude Revealed, and then have a very profound and rich Q&A. Louis Schwartzberg is an award-winning director. You probably have seen many of his films, including the recent hit Fantastic Fungi, which just went huge viral. He did Wings of Life with Meryl Streep. He's also had a non-stop motion camera running non-stop for the last over 35 years. And he has a bedrock of the most beautiful, just a vault of some of the most beautiful nature imagery. You can see him on Moving Arts on Netflix. He's also very, very much an expert in the world of gratitude. His TED Talk on gratitude is one of the most downloaded TED Talks of all time. It's been viewed over 5 million times. And his work on gratitude is also very cutting edge. Don't try and miss out and think that, it's just about writing in a gratitude journal and about gratitude, because you don't. There is so much cutting edge research. There's so much new information out there on gratitude. And there is that Time magazine article that I love about how gratitude can combat climate change. And Louis is going to be here. And I have to tell you, I work with a lot of really famous Academy Award-winning directors. And Louis is honestly one of the most vibrant and exciting speakers. I think he's truly one of the most brilliant minds and filmmakers of our time. So you just don't want to miss it. And you don't want to miss his take on gratitude and how he talks about things. And it's a real privilege to have him here. He's a busy guy right now. He's traveling all over the world. I had to pull in a lot of favors for this. So anyways, and I promise you, you can email me directly if you don't think it's one of the most engaging conversations. And the last thing I'll add is that there is so much cool research there. If you want to do a little sneak, Robert Emmons at UC Davis is doing amazing work in the world of gratitude. This will really blow your mind. So I hope everyone can make it next month.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Corinne. And thank you for facilitating that. I remember the night at your house where we thought about this and it came up with the last Myth Salon, and you're just a gem. So
Thanks.
Trying to be fewer words rather than more words. Let's just have a moment of silence, then Lori, thank you very much for responding to my humble request. After so many years, I love your work. I love what you do.
Thank you.
It's fabulous. Dennis, Kenny, Corinne, Mickey, and of course, Will. I love you all. Thank you very much, and good night, everyone. This has been
Thank you, Dana.
an absolute joy.
Thank you.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you.
Thanks, Lori.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Lori.
Kenny.
Inspiring.
Thank you, Kenny.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thanks, Corinne. Thanks,
Thank
Dennis.
you, everybody.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.
Wonderful evening.